The world had taken everything from Cora Vance, and then it had the audacity to ask for more. Every morning she descended into that basement. Every night she climbed back up with nothing but bruises and silence. She told herself this was simply the shape of her life now. Then on the coldest night of October, something heavy collapsed against the back door. Something that breathed. Something that changed everything. If you have ever believed that the most broken people sometimes find each other at exactly the right moment, stay with me until the very end. Leave a comment with your city. This story is for you. The grease never fully dried. That was the thing no one understood about Cora's particular kind of suffering. It was not the hunger, though she knew hunger well enough. It was not the cold that seeped through the stone foundation in October, though she had learned to sleep in her coat. It was the grease. It settled into the cracks of the wooden floor, into the seams of the walls, into the deep whorls of her fingerprints, and it never fully dried. It simply aged. It turned from translucent gold to a dark amber, to something nearly black, layer upon layer, year upon year, until the whole basement of the Silver Spur Saloon smelled like something that had given up trying to be clean. Cora Vance had given up something too, though she would have been hard-pressed to name the exact moment it happened. She stood at the great iron stove at 20 minutes past 4 in the morning, the rest of the mining town of Copperhead Gulch still locked in a dreamless November sleep, and she stirred a pot of elk stew that had been simmering since midnight. The steam rose in lazy columns and beaded on her brow. She did not wipe it away. Her hands were occupied, and besides the warmth was the only warmth she was likely to know today. She was a large woman. She had always been large, even as a girl in Ohio, when her mother had still been alive to call her sturdy, which was the kindest word the world had ever reliably offered her. Her frame was broad across the shoulders, and fuller still at the hip, built from genetics and from the strange metabolic stubbornness that had plagued the women on her father's side for as far back as anyone could remember. Her grandmother had called it the Vance Constitution. The men at the saloon called it other things, things she had learned to let slide off her the way water slides off oilcloth, because to absorb every cruelty would have been to drown in them. She had very nearly drowned once before. 2 years ago she had arrived in Copperhead Gulch as a different version of herself entirely. Not younger, she was 34 then, but more open, more willing to believe that the world might surprise her in pleasant ways. She had traveled west from Cincinnati with a man named Edmund Price, who had brown eyes that caught the light like polished wood, and a voice that could have talked the moon into trading places with the sun. He had called her remarkable. He had called her strong and capable and possessing of a natural grace that most women could only dream of. He had said these things with such consistency and such apparent sincerity that she had opened the locked room of her heart and handed him the key. He had taken rather more than the key. When Edmund Price disappeared from Copperhead Gulch on a Tuesday morning in early spring, he took with him $430 in gold coin, the entirety of Cora's savings, which she had accumulated over 11 years of domestic service in Cincinnati, washing and ironing and cooking for a succession of households that valued her labor and declined to value much else about her. He also took, as a parting gesture of extraordinary cruelty, the signed note he had apparently already given to Harlan Booth, the owner of the Silver Spur, which detailed a debt Price claimed Cora owed him, and which transferred that debt, along with Cora's obligation to work it off, to Booth's establishment. The law in Copperhead Gulch was a man named Deputy Cresswell, who drank Booth's whiskey for free and ate Booth's food at cost, and who explained to Cora with genuine-sounding regret that the note appeared to be legal, that Edmund Price appeared to have vanished beyond any recoverable horizon, and that her best course of action was to work off the debt and be grateful that Booth hadn't simply turned her out. So she had descended into the basement. And the grease had settled in. The floor above her creaked now. Heavy boots crossing the saloon, crossing back the loose board near the front door, announcing itself with its customary groan. Someone was awake early upstairs, or someone had never gone to sleep. Both possibilities were entirely ordinary at the Silver Spur. Cora added salt to the stew with the confidence of a woman who had learned to season things correctly long before anyone had thought to thank her for it. She had a gift for food that she herself considered unremarkable, which was perhaps why she had never attempted to leverage it into anything better. Her grandmother had taught her to cook over a wood fire in a farmhouse kitchen in rural Pennsylvania, had taught her the way heat moves through different cuts of meat, the way aromatics open when fat is applied at the correct temperature, the way bread dough communicates its readiness through the resistance it offers to the hands. Her grandmother had also taught her a working knowledge of local plants and their properties, which herbs reduced fever, and which roots purified blood, and which bark, prepared correctly, could pull infection from a wound the way a poultice pulls a splinter. She had not used that knowledge in a very long time. The stew was ready. She began ladling it into the heavy crockery bowls that lined the shelf above the stove, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had performed this sequence of actions so many times it had become a kind of prayer, something the body knows without the mind needing to be consulted. She would carry the bowls upstairs when Booth rang the bell at 6. She would serve the miners who came in for breakfast before their shift, accepting their orders without meeting their eyes, taking their coins without comment, returning to the kitchen with the same blank expression she had developed the way a body develops callus through repetition and pressure, and the simple biological imperative to protect what lies underneath. Outside, the wind off the Iron Pine Peaks had picked up. She could hear it working its way through the gaps in the saloon's exterior walls, that distinctive whistle that meant serious cold was coming, the kind that turned the mud in the street to iron before dawn. She pulled her coat a little tighter with one shoulder, not putting down the ladle, a small ballet of practical adaptation that she was no longer even conscious of performing. She was thinking, as she often thought in these hours, before the building filled with noise and obligation, about what spring might look like if she could simply survive until spring. It was a recurring thought, not a plan, exactly more of a landmark. If she could save enough, if she could calculate the precise moment when the debt would be retired, and Booth would have no legal claim left on her time, then spring might represent something genuine. She had a loose mental accounting that she revised periodically, as Booth periodically revised his numbers, adding charges for her room, which was the corner of the root cellar where she had placed her cot, and for her board, which was whatever was left from the kitchen after the paying customers had eaten, and for various other expenses that she was fairly certain were fabricated but could not prove. The mental accounting always came out in Booth's favor. She had, regardless, a small stash. Coins she had collected from the floor over many months, tips left by the occasional miner with a conscience, a dime she had found frozen into the mud of the alley and thawed in her coat pocket. She kept them in a cracked ceramic pot she had rescued from the trash hidden behind the stack of firewood at the far end of the root cellar. $47 and some change. Not enough for freedom. Enough to remind her that the concept of accumulation still applied to her life. She was not a woman who wept easily. She had wept considerably in the early months alone, on the cot in the root cellar with her face pressed into the coat she used as a pillow, and those tears had eventually done what tears do. When no relief comes, they had receded, leaving behind something harder and quieter. She endured. She did not perform endurance for an audience. She simply kept moving through the hours, kept the stove burning, kept the food prepared, kept herself oriented towards some future that she could not yet clearly see. This, her grandmother had told her once, is what the Vance women do. We outlast. A rat moved along the far wall in the darkness, and Cora tracked it with her peripheral vision without turning her head. She had made a kind of peace with the rats. They stayed on their side of the kitchen, she stayed on hers. It was the closest thing to a functional relationship she had developed in Copperhead Gulch. The bell rang at 6, as it always did. She carried the first tray of bowls upstairs. The saloon in the early morning was a different animal than the saloon at night. The lamps were turned low. The fire in the main hearth had burned to a deep orange that gave the room a quality of light that was almost gentle, and the men who came in for breakfast before their shift were different men than the ones who came in after, quieter, more concentrated on the particular misery of the work ahead. They ate with their eyes on the table. They drank coffee, not whiskey. They left without lingering. Cora moved among them like a weather system present, and unavoidable and impersonal. She refilled the coffee pot from the kitchen, cleared the bowls as they emptied, accepted the coins that were left, and ignored the ones that were not. It was Foley who ruined the morning. He usually did. Foley was a surveyor's assistant who had been in Copperhead Gulch for 6 months and had spent a considerable portion of those 6 months establishing for himself a reputation as a man who compensated for his own considerable personal deficiencies by directing attention toward the deficiencies of others. He was not a large man, which perhaps explained something. He was the kind of small man who needed a large target. He said something as she passed his table. The other men near him laughed. She did not respond. She carried her empty tray back toward the kitchen stairs with the same even tread, the same neutral expression, and she felt the familiar procedure engage the one where she located a place behind her own sternum and retreated into it, watching events from a careful interior distance. Booth from behind his bar watched this exchange with the mild satisfaction of a man who had long ago reached his own private conclusions about the natural order of things and found them confirmed repeatedly. Harlan Booth was 53 years old and looked older, a man weathered by decades of operating at the precise moral latitude where legality and exploitation share a comfortable border. He had small, light eyes that were surprisingly attentive. The kind of eyes that were always calculating something, and he wore the same canvas vest every day over a different shirt, as though the vest was the fixed point around which his personality orbited. He was not openly cruel in the way that Foley was openly cruel. His cruelty was administrative. It manifested in the numbers he kept in the ledger under the bar, in the small adjustments he made to Cora's account when she was not looking, in the way he would pause before answering a simple question, just long enough to communicate that the answer was his to give or withhold as he chose. He did not bother her this morning. He was occupied with a conversation with a man from the mining company who had ridden in late last night. She refilled the coffee, cleared the last bowls, wiped down the tables that needed it, and descended back into the basement. The day proceeded in the way that days at the Silver Spur proceeded. There was no single event of sufficient weight to interrupt the general rhythm of labor and marginalization. She prepared the noon meal. She hauled water up from the pump in the alley. She repaired a section of the kitchen shelving that had been threatening to collapse since August, using nails from the tin booth kept in the storage room and not asking permission, because she had learned that asking permission was simply an additional mechanism for denying it. By mid-afternoon, when the lunch rush had cleared, she descended to the root cellar to rest for an hour on the cot, which was her only genuine private time in a day that otherwise belonged entirely to the structure of someone else's enterprise. She lay on her back with her coat across her chest and looked at the raw timber ceiling and listened to the drip of the condensation that collected on the stone wall behind the woodpile. She thought about Cincinnati. Not with longing exactly, because the version of Cincinnati that existed in memory was already heavily edited. The cold mornings in the laundry room excised the particular loneliness of being a large, unbeautiful woman in a city where beauty was currency smoothed over. What remained in memory was the lakefront in summer, the smell of particular coffee from a particular shop on Vine Street, the feeling of having a room with a door that locked from the inside. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about spring because she always came back to spring. After the rest, she lit the lamp and went to check the woodpile for tomorrow's supply. The wood was running low. She would need to bring another cord in from the alley before the temperature dropped further. She was calculating the trips required, the number of pieces per armload, the time it would take when she heard it. Not from the alley, from the back. A sound low and heavy against the back door. She stood motionless for a moment, the lamp held out. The root cellar shared a wall with the back alley, and the back door, which was Cora's door exclusively since no one else bothered with it, was a thick plank construction that opened outward into the narrow passage between the saloon and the livery stable next door. The sound repeated. Something against the door pressing or falling against it, then a long silence, then a sound that was unmistakably human breathing, labored and wet and wrong. Cora set the lamp on the woodpile. She made a calculation that was not complicated and was also not simple. On the one side was every instinct of self-preservation that 20 months in Harlan Booth's establishment had honed to a considerable edge. On the other side was the sound of someone breathing like that in an alley in November, with the temperature dropping and the wind off the iron pine peaks, pushing hard and cold. She lifted the bar from the back door and pulled it open. He was not so much standing at the door as he was using the door as the last structural argument against the ground. He was enormous, taller than the doorframe, nearly broad through the chest and shoulders, in the way of a man who has spent his life in physical contest with wilderness rather than with other men, and he was bleeding from somewhere under his coat on his left side, a dark stain that had spread and dried and spread again. His face, what she could see of it under the beard, and the grime of whatever had happened to him, was the color of old paper. His eyes found her. They were dark eyes, black in the lamplight, and they were fully conscious, which surprised her. A man who looked like that should not have had conscious eyes. "Ma'am," he said. And that was all, and then the ground made its final argument and won. Cora caught approximately 30% of him with her body and managed to redirect the remaining 70% against the doorframe, and then gradually to the root cellar floor in a controlled enough sequence that neither of them was additionally injured by the arrival. She had moved large things before. She understood leverage. She stood breathing over him in the lamplight. He was alive. The breathing was terrible, a catch and a rattle that spoke of real damage, but it was continuous. She could see now that the wound under his coat was arrow-adjacent, meaning the arrow itself was gone, pulled or broken off, but the entry wound remained deep on the left side below the ribs, and around it the skin had taken on a color that she recognized from her grandmother's training as the particular color of tainted metal working against living tissue. Poisoned then, or badly infected, or both. She looked at the door to the alley still open. She looked at the stairs to the saloon. She looked at the man on the floor of her root cellar. She had perhaps 45 seconds to make a decision before Booth, or someone working for Booth, found reason to come downstairs. She closed the alley door and barred it. She dragged him behind the woodpile. She did not know at that moment who he was, or where he came from, or what had put an arrow in his side. These were not the relevant questions. The relevant question was the one her grandmother had taught her to ask first, before any treatment, before any intervention. Is this person, as best as I can determine, worth saving? She did not mean this in a moral sense. Her grandmother had been a practical woman who understood that emotional resources were finite. She meant, is this person likely to survive if I do everything correctly? She pulled the coat back from his side and examined the wound in the lamplight. The arrow had gone into the meat below the lowest rib, a deep puncture angled upward, which meant it had missed the lung, but potentially nicked other things. The flesh around it was hot and discolored. The particular smell told her what the color confirmed. It was bad. It was not necessarily fatal if she had the right materials and sufficient time, and if whatever was on the arrow had not already traveled too far. She had most of the right materials accumulated slowly and deliberately over many months, because she was the sort of person who prepared for contingencies. She did not have sufficient time, so she would have to manufacture it. She went upstairs and told Booth she was sick, which was not precisely a lie because her hands were shaking. She said she thought it was a stomach complaint from the elk, which had been running a little close to the bone quality-wise. Booth told her to keep it to herself and be back at her post by morning. She agreed, and descended again. She worked through the night. The man on the floor of her root cellar did not make it easy. He was intermittently conscious and intermittently delirious, and when he was delirious, he had the significant disadvantage of being enormously strong, which meant that when she was trying to clean the wound, he occasionally tried to prevent her in ways that required her to apply her full considerable weight to keep him still. She had bruises on both forearms by midnight. She did not stop working. She cleaned the wound with the best of what she had diluted spirits from a bottle she had long ago taken from the kitchen and stored for purposes that had never before arisen. She applied a poultice of the dried herbs she kept in a cloth bag at the bottom of her supply box, her grandmother's specific combination for drawing infection and reducing fever, plantain and yarrow, and something else that had no common name in English, but which her grandmother had called simply the bitter root, and which she had gathered herself from the Pennsylvania hills every autumn of Cora's childhood. She wrapped the wound firmly, working with the expertise of someone who had observed this done many times, who had helped do it, and who had a natural aptitude for the kind of concentrated, detailed physical work that most people found tedious. She kept the lamp low. She kept her ears fixed on the sounds from upstairs. Around 2 a.m, the fever spiked. He said things in his delirium that she did not fully understand. Something about a pass and something about a name. A woman's name said with a bitterness that was audible even through the fever, and she noted these things and filed them and kept working. His temperature was alarming. She made the decision to use the last of the dried willow bark she had been hoarding, boiling it in the small pot she kept in the root cellar for her own private use, and pouring it into him in small amounts every time he was briefly conscious enough to swallow. By 3 a.m, the fever had not broken, but had stopped climbing. She sat back against the woodpile and looked at him in the lamplight. In the absence of crisis, she allowed herself to actually see him for the first time. He was perhaps 40, perhaps older. It was difficult to know under the beard, and the evidence of a hard life, lived mostly outdoors. There were old scars on both hands, the specific distributed scarring of a man who worked with knives and snares and rough wood. His clothing, though filthy and bloody, was of good quality in its original intention, the heavy canvas and wool of someone who knew cold country and knew how to dress for it. A mountain man, then, or something close to it. She looked at the wound, which was already looking marginally better than it had 4 hours ago, which she took as a reasonable sign. She did not sleep. She kept the lamp burning low and sat against the woodpile and listened to him breathe, and every hour she checked the wound and adjusted the poultice and fed him more of the willow bark tea when he could manage it, and at some point before dawn the fever broke in a long wave of sweat that soaked through his shirt and his coat. Both and his breathing changed from that terrible rattling catch to something deeper and more regular, and Cora Vance, who did not cry easily, felt something move behind her eyes that she did not permit to become tears. She had seen enough crying in this root cellar. She went upstairs and made the morning stew. He was still there when she came back down. He was still there the next day, and the day after that, hidden behind the woodpile under the blanket she had draped over him, and the 2 extra blankets she had taken from the storage room and replaced before Booth noticed. She fed him broth in small amounts when he was conscious. She changed the poultice twice a day. She moved through her regular work with the same blank competence, giving Booth and the saloon nothing to notice or question. On the 3rd day, his eyes opened with full clarity for the first time. He looked at the root cellar ceiling for a moment. Then he turned his head and looked at her where she sat on her cot, a few feet away, with her coat pulled around her shoulders, mending a tear in her apron with the focused attention she gave to any task that allowed her hands to be occupied. "You're not a doctor," he said. His voice was rough as gravel unused. "No," she said. She did not look up from the mending. A pause. He seemed to be conducting a careful inventory of his situation. "How long?" 3 days. Another pause longer. "The wound is healing," she said, because he was going to ask. "You had something on that arrow. I think I got most of it before it went too far. The fever broke night before last." He was quiet for a long time. She finished the tear in the apron and bit the thread and folded it. "Where am I?" "Root Cellar, Silver Spur Saloon, Copperhead Gulch." She watched him process this information and watched the particular expression that crossed his face when he processed it. Not alarm, not confusion, but the careful recalibration of a man who has encountered an unexpected variable and is determining its implications. "Does Booth know I'm here?" "No." He looked at her then with full attention, those dark eyes now clear and steady. She met the look briefly and returned to straightening the apron. "Why?" he said. It was a one-word question of considerable depth, and she gave it the consideration it deserved before answering. "I heard you at the door," she said. "I opened it. Once I'd opened it, the rest followed." He absorbed this. She could tell by something in his posture that he understood she was not giving him the sentimental answer, and that he appreciated the distinction. "Silas Montgomery," he said. "Cora Vance." He tried to sit up. The try was unsuccessful. She watched him discover this without comment. "You'll be at it at least another week," she said. "Maybe more. The damage was real, and it's getting colder. There's a serious storm coming, probably within the week, by the way the birds have been moving." He lay back. His jaw was set in a particular way that she recognized as a man at war with his own body's limitations, a feeling she understood professionally. Outside, the wind pushed against the saloon's stone foundation, cold and purposeful, carrying the first real smell of winter down from the iron pine peaks, that clean and merciless cold that had no interest in human plans or human survival except as interesting variables in a much larger equation. Cora folded the mended apron and stood. "Broth's ready," she said. "Can you manage sitting up if I help?" He said he could. He was wrong, but between the two of them they arrived at a compromise position that served well enough, and she held the cup for him while he drank, and neither of them spoke, and the lamp burned low between them, and that was how it began. He got stronger faster than she expected, which created problems she had not fully anticipated. The first problem was noise. A man of Silas Montgomery's dimensions, even weakened, was not a man designed for the particular art of existing without evidence. He shifted on the cot, which creaked. He coughed, though he learned quickly to muffle it against the blanket. He needed water in quantities that required Cora to make additional trips to the alley pump at odd hours, trips she justified to herself and to the general architecture of the saloon's routine by slightly altering the timing of her kitchen tasks. She was good at this kind of invisible adjustment. She had been making them for nearly 2 years. The second problem was Booth. Not that Booth suspected anything specific, but Booth had the antennae of a man whose livelihood depended on noticing the small irregularities in the behavior of people he controlled, and on the 4th day of Silas's residence in the root cellar, Booth came downstairs at an hour he did not typically come downstairs and stood in the kitchen doorway with his small, attentive eyes moving around the room in their habitual, calculating way. Cora was at the stove. She did not turn around. "Thought I heard something last night," Booth said. "Rats?" she said. "Big one. I'll set a trap." A pause. The kind of pause Booth deployed deliberately because silence was another form of pressure, and he used every tool available to him. "You look tired," he said. "I'm always tired." Another pause. Then the sound of him climbing back upstairs, and she stood at the stove and breathed slowly and evenly until the sound of his boots crossed the full length of the saloon above her and she heard him settle back into his chair behind the bar. That evening she told Silas. She said it without preamble, sitting on her cot across from where he lay, her voice low and even. "He's going to find you if you stay much longer. Another week, maybe less." Silas was sitting partially upright, which he had managed for the first time that morning, propped against the stone wall with the blanket across his chest. The color had come back into his face. Not fully, not yet, but enough to suggest that the man underneath the damage was someone who had been fundamentally difficult to kill long before this particular attempt. "How much would he get for turning me in?" Silas asked. Cora looked at him. "You know there's a price on you." I assumed by this point. He said it without apparent distress. "There's a family in Helena with enough money and enough motivation. I've been expecting it." She waited. When he did not continue, she asked the question that had been living in the root cellar alongside them for 4 days, occupying its own quiet corner. "What did you do?" He held her look for a moment. His dark eyes were direct. She had learned that about him. He did not look away from questions the way people who were hiding significant things tended to look away. "I was engaged," he said, "to a woman named Adelaide Channing. Her family owns half the silver contracts in the Western Territory. I discovered 3 weeks before the wedding that her father had been falsifying the assay reports on his secondary mines, selling shares in ore deposits that were mostly worthless to investors who trusted the Channing name." He paused. "I told Adelaide I intended to report it. She told her father. Her father had me charged with embezzlement and fraud charges that were complete fabrications, but fabrications supported by their money and their lawyers and their particular relationship with the territorial judge. And you ran. I ran because the alternative was a prison sentence for crimes I did not commit, which would have accomplished nothing except satisfying the Channings." His jaw set in that way she had come to recognize. "I have been on the mountain for 14 months. I have a cabin in the Iron Pine High Country. I have been working my trap lines and selling pelts through a trader in Millhaven who does not ask questions. The arrangement has been functional. Until someone found your trail. Until someone found my trail." The lamp between them burned. From upstairs came the sound of the evening crowd arriving, boots and voices, and the particular percussion of a saloon finding its nighttime rhythm. "The Arrow," Cora said. 2 men. They came up the East Ridge 3 days ago. I handled them, but not before the second one managed to get a shot off." He said this with the flat economy of someone reporting weather. "There will be more. There are always more when the Channings are writing the checks." Cora was quiet, turning this information in her mind with the same methodical attention she gave to any problem of logistics. She was not, she realized, surprised. She had made an assessment of this man in the first hours of his arrival, before he was conscious enough to offer any information at all, and nothing he had just told her materially altered that assessment. "I need to get back to my cabin," he said, "before the first real snow closes the high passes. If I miss that window, I'm stuck in the valley all winter. You're not ready to make that climb. I'm aware of that." A silence settled between them of the productive variety, the kind where 2 people who are both thinking arrive at the edge of the same conclusion from different directions. "How long?" he said. To get you functional enough for a mountain ascent in serious cold, she considered it properly. 10 days, possibly 12. Your body is still fighting the toxin. You push it before it's finished, you'll be 2 days up the trail and down again. He absorbed this with a particular quality of stillness. She had learned that this was how he processed difficulty, not with visible agitation, but with a concentrated internal management that expressed itself as near-perfect external calm. It was a quality she recognized because it was the same quality she had spent 2 years developing in herself. "Then we have a problem," he said. "We have several." She agreed. She did not sleep well that night. Not from worry exactly, though. The situation offered reasonable material for it, but from the specific restlessness of a mind that has been handed a genuine puzzle and cannot leave it alone. She lay on her cot and worked the variables. Booth's suspicion, which was growing. Silas's timeline, which was narrowing. The approaching winter, which would make the mountain passes impassable within weeks. Her own situation, which had not changed and would not change by inaction. That last variable was the one that kept returning. She had been in this root cellar for 20 months. In 20 more months, if Booth's accounting continued its customary drift, she might be no closer to freedom than she was tonight. The calculation did not change. The spring she had been orienting herself toward remained at the same theoretical distance, regardless of how much actual time passed. She stared at the timber ceiling and listened to the building breathe around her. On the morning of the 5th day, Silas sat fully upright without assistance and ate the breakfast she brought him without looking like the effort of sitting was likely to cost him more than he had available. She watched him eat with the clinical attention of someone monitoring a patient's recovery, which was what she was doing, and noted with satisfaction that his hands were steady. Steadier than they had been yesterday. The body was working. "I want to ask you something," he said when the bowl was empty. She waited. "How much do you owe Booth?" The question landed in the space between them with a weight she had not anticipated. She looked at him directly for a moment, this mountain man sitting on the cot in her root cellar, with a bowl balanced on his knee, and those dark eyes fixed on her with an attention that was neither intrusive nor performative. "Why?" she said. "Because I'm trying to think through a problem," he said. "And you're a material part of it, and I don't like working with incomplete information." She told him the number Booth claimed. She watched his expression specifically, for the thing that often appeared on people's faces when they learned the details of her situation, a particular compound of pity and judgment that she had never found useful. It did not appear. "Is the debt legal?" he asked. "Borderline. Probably defensible in court if Booth had better lawyers than the ones available in Copperhead Gulch." She paused. "The original note was signed by someone else on my behalf. Whether that constitutes a binding obligation is something I've thought about at considerable length. But you've stayed." "I've stayed because leaving without satisfying the debt would give Booth grounds to have me pursued, and because I have nowhere specific to go, and because, until recently, the arithmetic of survival has favored endurance over action." She said this without inflection. It was simply the truth. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What if there was a third option?" She looked at him. He told her then. He was not a man who elaborated unnecessarily, which she appreciated. He laid it out with the same flat economy he had used to describe the Channings, the facts first, the implications following no decoration. He had a cabin in the Iron Pine High Country, built and fortified over 14 months of solitary work, stocked with enough food and supplies to get through a serious winter. He had a trap line that ran 30 miles of prime country, and had in the 2 seasons he had worked, it produced enough pelts to represent a genuinely significant income sold through his trader in Mill Haven. He had the skills to work the trap line and to manage the mountain in any weather, but the wound had compromised him in ways that mattered, and the winter ahead was going to be real. "I can't work the line and manage the cabin both," he said. "Not this winter, not with this." He gestured briefly at his side. And you kept me alive when you had no particular reason to, and you know how to do things that matter, and you're rotting in this basement for a debt that isn't even legitimately yours." He held her look. "I'm not offering charity. I'm not in a position to offer charity, and I wouldn't insult you with it if I were. I'm offering a partnership of specific utility. You get me through the winter. Handle the cabin help with the line when you can use whatever skills you have. Come spring, I split the pelt harvest down the middle, 50% of the take, which should be enough for you to buy your debt and have real money left over. Enough to go somewhere. Do something. The lamp between them burned steadily. You could hire someone, she said. I could, I won't. Hired men talk. He paused. You haven't told Booth I'm here. It was a simple statement of observed fact. He was not flattering her. He was simply noting the evidence he had available. Cora sat with the proposal for a long moment. She turned it the way she turned all practical problems, examining each face of it methodically. The risks, which were real against the alternative, which was also a risk only slower and more certain. I'd need to pay the debt before leaving, she said finally. Legally, I won't give him grounds to follow. Can you cover it with what you have? Not fully. But if your line has produced what you say it has, and if you have pelts stored, I have a winter's worth in the cash at the cabin, already cured and bundled, enough to advance your portion. She looked at him, at this man who had arrived at her door as a problem and who was now proposing to share the proceeds of his livelihood with her based on an assessment of her character that he had formed in 5 days while barely conscious. She was not naive. She was not going to mistake practicality for sentiment. But she was also not going to pretend that the proposal was anything other than what it appeared to be, which was a genuine offer made by a man who valued function over form, and who had looked at Cora Vance in this root cellar and seen someone worth making a deal with. I'll need 3 days to arrange it, she said. I have to move carefully with Booth. 3 days, he agreed. What followed was 3 of the more delicate days Cora had navigated since her arrival in Copperhead Gulch. She moved through her regular work with particular attention, making no changes significant enough to register, offering Booth no additional cause for his antennae to activate. At the same time, she was conducting a secondary operation of careful preparation. She assessed the exact state of the debt ledger which Booth kept under the bar, and which she had read upside down and in fragments often enough to have a reasonable reconstruction of it. She calculated with the information Silas had given her about the cached pelts what she could offer. She identified the specific mechanism Booth would respond to. Harlan Booth, she had learned, could be moved by one thing with reliable consistency. It was not conscience, which was vestigial at best. It was not sentiment. It was arithmetic. Booth had a particular relationship with numbers that was almost aesthetic, a preference for the account that came out correctly, for the ledger that balanced, that expressed itself in the way he ran his fingers down the pages of his record book in the evenings with something approaching contentment. She needed to make the arithmetic point in the right direction. On the second day, she approached the question sideways. She found a moment when Booth was in the moderate good humor that followed a profitable Saturday night, and said conversationally that she understood there was a bounty hunter operation moving through the region. Booth's eyes sharpened. She had his attention. She said she had heard talk in the kitchen from the miners. Nothing specific, but there was apparently a serious effort underway to find someone in the high country, and the parties involved had money. Helena money, someone had said. This was partly true. Silas had confirmed the general fact, and the miners who came in for breakfast talked freely in the kitchen doorway, as though Cora were part of the furniture, which was one of the few genuine operational advantages of being consistently underestimated. She let the conversation rest there. She did not push. Booth was now turning something in his own mind. She could see it in the way he polished a glass more slowly than necessary. She went back to the kitchen and let the idea work on him at its own pace. That night she told Silas what she had said. He was quiet for a moment. "You're baiting him," he said. "I'm managing his attention," she said. "I need him focused on the potential reward from someone else's operation rather than on what's happening in his own root cellar. If he thinks there's money moving through the territory, he'll be watching the road, not the basement. Silas looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, which was not an experience she often had with people's expressions. Most people were in her observation quite legible. He was less so. "That's a calculated risk," he said. "Everything I've done in the last week has been a calculated risk," she said. "I'm accustomed to the calculation." On the third day, she went to Booth before the lunch rush. She laid out the offer without theater. She had secured, she said, a sum that would cover the full balance of her debt, as Booth calculated it with a small additional amount above the stated number. She was prepared to settle the account today. She had the amount in her coat. Booth looked at her. Then he looked at the amount she had indicated, because she had written it on a slip of paper, and slid it across the bar, because she understood him well enough to know that numbers on paper were more real to him than numbers spoken aloud. "Where'd you get it?" he said. "I've been saving," she said. Which was true as far as it went. He sat with it. She watched him work through the arithmetic, watched him weigh the reliable present sum against the theoretical future value of continued exploitation. Watched him arrive at the place she had guided him toward, which was the entirely reasonable conclusion that a settled debt was a closed account, and a closed account could not develop unexpected complications. "I want it in coin," he said. "It's in coin," she said. "The transaction took 20 minutes. Booth produced the ledger. They verified the numbers. She placed the coins on the bar in stacks with the methodical patience of a woman who understood that this moment required precision and would not be rushed. Booth counted the stacks twice. He wrote "paid in full" in the ledger and signed his name, and she asked for a copy, which he provided with the grudging compliance of a man who recognized a legal precaution when he saw one and knew better than to refuse it. She folded the paper and placed it in her coat. She went downstairs. She had chosen the distraction with some care. The grease trap beneath the main stove had been accumulating for weeks, and a small fire in the kitchen, contained and manageable, would produce enough smoke and excitement to empty the building for at least 20 minutes. She had arranged for this with the specific timing that would coincide with the moment Booth was occupied dealing with the smoke in his front room. It took 40 seconds to start, and another 3 minutes to produce the necessary drama upstairs. She could hear the shouting, the boots, the particular chaos of a room full of men responding to the word "fire" with the mix of alarm and aggressive enthusiasm that word reliably produced. She went to Silas. Now, she said. He was ready. He had been ready. He rose from the cot with the deliberate care of a man managing real pain without allowing the pain to manage him, and she positioned herself at his left side, and they moved. The alley was dark, and the cold was a physical object, a wall of it pressing in from the north. But the sounds from the front of the building covered the sounds of the back door, and the two figures moving through the alley and around the corner to where she had placed the pack she had assembled over 3 days, piece by piece, from the storage room and from her own small collection of possessions. She did not look back at the silver spur. There was nothing there worth looking back at. They moved through the dark edge of Copperhead Gulch toward the trailhead that Silas had described, the one that climbed into the Iron Pine Peaks along the south ridge, and the wind came down off the high country in long, cold sweeps that smelled of pine and granite and the particular clarity of elevation, and Cora Vance, for the first time in 20 months, breathed it in without a ceiling above her and a debt between her and the sky. Silas walked beside her, slower than his natural pace, managing the wound with the tight economy of someone rationing pain. "You planned the fire," he said. "It put itself out," she said. "I just encouraged it." A brief silence. Then from him something she had not yet heard. Not approval exactly, and not surprise. Something quieter than either. "Good thinking," he said. She said nothing. She adjusted the pack on her shoulders and kept walking. Above them, the Iron Pine Peak stood dark against a sky full of stars, massive and cold and indifferent. in the way that only wilderness is truly indifferent without malice, without mercy. Simply present, simply enormous, waiting with the perfect patience of stone for whatever was coming next. Her legs were strong. They had always been strong. She pointed them upward. The trail into the Iron Pine Peaks did not care about human arrangements. It rose from the valley floor in long switchbacks that looked from below like a manageable proposition, and revealed themselves within the first hour to be something considerably more honest than that. The path was old, worn by decades of animal traffic and the occasional trapper who knew this country, and it climbed with the indifference of geology, steep where the rock said steep, narrow where the cliff edge pressed in exposed to the wind, where the tree line thinned and offered nothing between a person and the full ambition of the November sky. Silas set the pace. It was slower than either of them wanted, and faster than his body strictly recommended. And Cora walked a half-step behind him on the uphill sections, positioned so that if the wound took his strength without warning, she could intercept the fall. She did not announce this. He did not acknowledge it. It was simply the physical grammar of two people who had without formal discussion arrived at an understanding of what each one could and could not do. They did not talk much on the climb. The altitude took the spare breath quickly, and what remained was occupied by the work of the trail itself, the placing of feet on uncertain ground, the management of the pack weight on the descending traverses, the reading of the sky, which by midday had taken on the particular flat gray quality that meant the weather was assembling itself into something serious to the north. By the second hour, Silas had stopped favoring the wound with visible effort and started simply carrying it, which she recognized as the difference between a man who was struggling and a man who had decided that struggling was no longer a useful response to the situation. She adjusted her assessment of his recovery upward slightly. They made the first ridge before the light changed. He stopped at the crest and turned, not to look at her, but to look back at the valley below, at Copperhead Gulch laid out in the distance, like a dirty smudge, against the ochre of the lowland grass, the silver spur, identifiable by its size and position even from this elevation. She stood beside him and looked too. She felt nothing that surprised her. No grief, no residual attachment, nothing she would have needed to conceal. What she felt was the particular clean sensation of a conclusion that had been deferred for a very long time, finally arriving on its own terms. "Anything you left down there, you need," he said. It was not quite a question. "No," she said. He nodded once and turned back to the trail. The cabin was another 3 hours above the first ridge through a section of dense lodgepole pine that broke eventually into a high meadow, now mostly gray and frost-killed, and then up a final steep approach to a rock shelf where the structure sat with its back against the mountain and its face toward a view of the valley that in better weather would have been remarkable. In the flat gray of late afternoon, it was simply there, solid and low-built, from the same granite as the shelf it occupied, with a roof of heavy timber and split shake that had been constructed, Cora could see at a glance, by someone who understood weight loads and snowpack. Silas unlocked the door with a key from his coat and pushed it open, and she followed him inside. The interior was a single large room with a smaller room partitioned at the back, a sleeping area she could see through the open doorway. The main room held a substantial stone hearth, a heavy table, 2 chairs, a workbench along the east wall, covered with tools and trap hardware, and along the north wall, floor to ceiling, the shelving she had half expected from his description. Dried meat in quantity, grain in sealed tins, root vegetables in cold storage boxes, lantern oil, ammunition in careful rows. He had been preparing for a siege without quite knowing it. "Cache is underneath," he said, lifting a section of the floor planking near the hearth to reveal the cold storage beneath, where the bundled pelts were stacked in the compressed silence of something that had been waiting to become money. She could see, even in the dim light, that the quality was exceptional. Prime winter fox-thick beaver, a stack of marten that would have made the trader in Millhaven sit up straighter in his chair. She crouched and ran her hand across the top bundle. The fur was dressed correctly, cured with the patience and precision of someone who understood that the difference between adequate work and excellent work in the pelt trade was the difference between a fair price and a very good one. "You know what you're doing," she said. "With the trapping," he said. "The cooking has been an ongoing tragedy." She stood and looked at the hearth, which was cold, and the kitchen area beside it, which told the story of a man who had been eating for survival rather than for any of the other reasons a person eats. She began building the fire. The first 3 days in the cabin were an education in proximity. They had existed in the root cellar in a version of closeness that was defined by emergency, which imposed its own structure. In the cabin, the emergency was over, and what remained was simply two people occupying the same space who were not, by any previous relationship or shared history, supposed to be easy with each other. There was a period of adjustment that neither of them named or discussed expressed. Instead, through the careful calibration of physical distance of speaking when necessary and not when not, of developing a working rhythm around the stove and the table and the management of the daily tasks that the mountain imposed. Cora discovered the particular pleasures of a kitchen that was hers to organize as she chose. She rearranged the shelving on the second morning, with Silas watching from his chair by the hearth, saying nothing, his expression conveying a moderate curiosity and no territorial objection. She found his stores more comprehensive than they had appeared at first examination. He had a good instinct for what mattered: salt, fat, dried aromatics, the things that transformed raw protein into something a person could eat, with their full attention rather than out of simple necessity. She made a venison stew that first evening that was, she considered, objectively quite good. He ate 2 full bowls and did not comment, but he held the second bowl with both hands in the particular way that a person holds something that is providing genuine comfort, and she counted this. By the 4th day, they had established a functional domestic language. She managed the interior, the cooking, and the curing, and the organization of the supplies. He managed the exterior, the wood supply, the condition of the cabin structure, the checking of the nearest trap stations which he could reach at this point in his recovery, without re-injuring himself if he was careful, which he was. It was on the 4th day that she found the book. It was on the workbench under a length of curing leather, a well-traveled volume with a broken spine. John Muir's observations on mountain wilderness annotated in a small, precise hand throughout its margins. The annotations were not summary notes. They were arguments, sometimes agreements, and sometimes not, conducted by a man who had strong opinions about mountains and was not unwilling to express them in dialogue with a published author in a book's margins at some unspecified hour of the night. She read 3 pages of margins before she put it down. She had not expected that. She was not sure what she had expected, but whatever shape she had assigned to Silas Montgomery in her private assessment, the margin annotations complicated it in interesting ways. The 5th day brought the first real snow. It came in the late afternoon without particular announcement, a shift in the light, and then the flakes beginning small and purposeful, the kind that means business rather than the tentative early-season snow that stops and considers itself overnight. By the time Silas came in from checking the trap line's nearest station, his coat was white across the shoulders, and his beard had caught the flakes and held them. "It's starting," he said. "I know," she said. She had been watching it from the window for an hour and rearranging the winter stores accordingly. The root vegetables needed to come into the warmer section. The exterior woodpile needed to be covered before morning. These were not complicated conclusions, but they required action, and she had already begun. He looked at the work she had done, and then at her, and said, "You've wintered in the mountains before." "No, but I've thought carefully about what that would require." He pulled off the snowy coat and hung it by the door. She could see in the set of his shoulders as he moved that the climb had cost him more than he would acknowledge. "Sit down," she said. "Let me look at the wound." "It's fine." "Sit down," she said again with the same inflection, the one that was not a request. He sat. She unwrapped the bandaging and examined the healing, which was progressing correctly, but which had produced in the area around the original entry point the kind of deep tissue tightness that a cold day and a long climb would aggravate considerably. She pressed carefully along the surrounding muscle and watched his face, which remained steady except for the brief, involuntary tension that told her what she needed to know. She rewrapped the wound with fresh linen and did not comment on what she had found. "Tomorrow you stay in," she said. "The East Station needs checking. I'll check it." He looked at her with the expression that meant he was preparing an objection, and she met the look with the patient certainty of someone who has already decided the outcome of this conversation and is simply waiting for the other party to arrive at the same conclusion. "You don't know the trail to the East Station," he said. "Then tell me." A pause. He told her. She listened, the way she listened to everything that mattered, completely and without interrupting. The East Station was 40 minutes out and 40 minutes back in good conditions. In fresh snow, perhaps an hour each way. She went the next morning with the light carrying the pack he had prepared the night before, with the equipment for resetting the traps, her coat belted tight, and her boots wrapped in the extra oilskin strips she had found in the supply chest. The snow had continued overnight and was now 8 inches on the level deeper in the drifts. She found the trail where he had described it, and she moved through the white morning with the steady pace of a woman who understood that cold and distance are both negotiations, not confrontations. The pine forest closed around her, silent in the particular way that a snow-covered forest is silent, a sound that is also a kind of presence, the absence of everything smaller than the wind and the weight of the flakes landing on the branches above. She found the East Station and reset the traps and turned back. It was on the return, taking the shorter route he had described as a secondary option, that she came to the stream. It was a run of clear mountain water moving fast enough to resist the ice that had formed along both banks, channeled between granite boulders into a pool below a small fall, before continuing down the slope. She had been warm from the walking and the work, and the pool offered the possibility she had been noting with the clinical awareness of a body that had not had a genuine wash in 2 weeks of hard travel and hard labor. She stood at the bank and looked upstream and downstream and in both directions of the trail and saw nothing moving in the white silence. She undressed quickly, folding her clothes on a dry boulder, and moved into the water. It was the kind of cold that announces itself as a full-body conversation, immediate and non-negotiable. And she submerged to her shoulders and felt every road mile and every root cellar night and every saloon morning release from her skin in a long, shuddering exhale. She scrubbed with the small bar of soap she had brought from the cabin pocket, working quickly, her breath visible in the air above her. She was efficient. She was always efficient. But there was a moment, perhaps 2 minutes in, when the efficiency paused, and she was simply standing in cold mountain water in the silence, and she looked down at herself the way a person rarely allows themselves to look fully and without the protective speed of habitual motion. She had a body that the world had consistently described as a problem. She knew its particular geography, the heavy roundness of it, the places where the skin marked the history of what it had carried, the legs that were thick and strong, and the arms that were stronger, the belly that curved without apology. She had dressed this body, fed this body, put it to work, and driven it through 20 months of the Silver Spur, and a week of mountain climbing, and a morning of trapline work in 8-inch snow, and it had performed every single requirement without failure. She knew this. The knowledge did not always reach the place where it would have been most useful. The tears, when they came, were the quiet kind, not theatrical, simply there, the specific tears of a woman who is completely alone for the first time in weeks, and allows herself for 2 minutes only to feel the full weight of everything she has been carrying without setting it down. She did not hear him on the trail. She became aware of Silas at the edge of her peripheral vision where the trail came through the trees to the stream bank. A stillness that was different from the stillness of the forest around it because it had intention. She turned her head, and he was there, motionless on the bank, having apparently come looking for her, because she had been gone longer than the route should have required. He had seen her. The expression on his face was not what she had prepared for. She had spent enough of her life managing the expressions that people produced when confronted with her body, from overt mockery to the particular cruelty of theatrical indifference, and she had a system for that. The same interior retreat, the same careful maintenance of nothing visible on her own face in return. His expression required none of her systems. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has just provided irrefutable evidence of a proposition he had been forming. He turned away immediately and completely presenting his back to the stream. "I'll wait on the trail," he said. His voice was entirely ordinary. She dressed efficiently and met him on the trail, and they walked back to the cabin with the same working silence they had developed over the previous days, and she did not know what to do with what she had seen on his face, so she did not do anything with it. She put it in the careful place where she kept things that required more time and better circumstances to examine. Dinner that evening was quieter than usual. He ate, she ate. The fire worked steadily at the hearth. The snow against the window had the sound of something patient. "The East Station had a good catch," she said finally. "Good," he said. Another silence. "Cora," he said. She looked up from the bowl. He was looking at the fire, not at her. His hands wrapped around his cup, and she could see him working toward something with the particular internal effort of a man who does not speak easily about things that matter. "People look at you." He started, then stopped, started again. "People look at you and they see what's easiest to see." He paused again. His voice, when he continued, was low and rough, scraped from somewhere genuine. "I look at you, and I see what it took to build that, what that body has survived just to keep you standing, every single day of what your life has been." He stopped. He was still looking at the fire. "It is the most honest thing I have ever seen," he said, "in a life that has had very little honesty in it." The fire moved. Outside, the snow continued. Cora sat with his words for a long moment, feeling them reach the place where she kept the things she had been protecting for the better part of 20 months, the part of her that had been built in a farmhouse kitchen in Pennsylvania, and educated in kindness before the world had systematically educated it in something else. She did not respond immediately because the words deserve better than an immediate response. She looked at the side of his face, the line of jaw under the beard, the crease at the eye that appeared when he was thinking hard about something. He was not looking at her. He had said the thing and was now giving her the space of not looking at her, which was, she recognized, a form of the same courtesy she had been extending to him since the morning on the trail. "That's a strange thing to say to a business partner," she said at last. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but its antecedent. "Yes," he said, "I suppose it is." The fire settled in the hearth and sent a brief shower of sparks up the flue. She pulled the blanket across her lap and picked up her bowl again, and the evening resumed its ordinary texture, but something in the ordinary texture had shifted in some small and permanent way. A stone moved from one side of a scale to the other, changing the reading. She slept better that night than she had in as long as she could accurately remember. In the morning she found beside the stove, where she would not miss it, a small crock that had not been there the night before. She opened it and found lanolin premium quality, pale and clean-smelling, not the rough commercial grade, but something that had cost real money to acquire. She looked at it for a long moment. She thought about the distance to Millhaven, which was the nearest trading post, which was not near. She thought about the state of the trail in fresh snow which she had traversed 2 days ago and knew to be serious work. She thought about his wound, which made that trip something more than merely difficult. She said nothing when he came in from the wood supply. She did not look at him with any particular expression, but that evening, when her hands cracked and bleeding at the knuckles from the daily contact with salt and cold water and curing solutions lay still in her lap by the fire, he sat beside her chair and took them in his and applied the lanolin with the focused, quiet care of someone performing a task they have thought about considerably. His hands were large enough to hold both of hers together, and he worked the cream in slowly, methodically, the way she worked at any task that mattered. She did not pull away. She looked at the fire, and her hands were still in his, and the hearthlight moved over the walls of the cabin, and somewhere outside the iron pine peaks held their altitude against the pressing dark cold and enormous and impartial. And inside this small room, against the mountain's flank, something that had no name yet, and did not need one, was deciding with the unhurried certainty of things that are real to stay. 3 weeks into December, the mountain settled into its full winter character, and the cabin became the entire world. This was not a complaint. Cora had discovered something about herself in the compression of those weeks that she had not previously had the circumstances to discover, which was that she was at a fundamental level suited to this. Not to confinement, she had had enough of confinement, but to the particular density of a life that had been reduced to its essential components. Fire, food, work. The man across the table. The trap line ran 30 miles in a rough arc through the high country and required checking in rotation a different section every 2 to 3 days, depending on weather and snowpack. Silas had returned to working his share of it by the 3rd week, his wound healed enough that the argument against his going out had become untenable, though she made the longer eastern runs herself and did not make an issue of the arrangement. He accepted this with the same unsentimental practicality with which he accepted most things which she had come to understand was not indifference, but a form of respect. The acknowledgement that she was capable of making accurate assessments and acting on them. The work had changed her hands. They were stronger now, the knuckles rougher, the palms calloused in new places from the trap hardware and the skinning knife and the long poles she used to navigate the deeper drifts. The lanolin kept the worst of the cracking at bay. He replenished the crock without announcement when it ran low, and she used it without comment, and the small ritual of that evening care by the fire had become part of the cabin's grammar, as established and unremarkable as the morning coffee and the nightly check of the exterior latch. What had changed between them was not dramatic. It accumulated the way snowpack accumulates each day, adding a layer that was individually invisible but collectively transformative. He had begun to speak more in the evenings. Not extensively, he was not a man of extensive speech, but with a quality of voluntariness that had not been present in the early days when conversation had been purely functional. He told her about the mountains in summer, the high meadows above the tree line, where the ground was covered in wildflowers so dense they looked painted the way the light moved through the granite peaks at evening in a way he had never found adequate language for. He told her about his time in the East before Montana, the reading he had done, the particular books that had stayed with him. She told him about Cincinnati, the parts that were true, not the edited version she had been carrying in memory, but the actual version, the cold laundry mornings and the specific loneliness, and also the lakefront in summer and the coffee on Vine Street. She told him about her grandmother, with a fullness she had not allowed herself since arriving in Copperhead Gulch, the farmhouse kitchen and the bitter root, and the particular quality of that old woman's attention when she was teaching, as though the knowledge itself was precious, and the act of passing it on was something close to sacred. He listened the way he did everything completely. It was on the 22nd day of December that the dogs came. She heard them first, which was unusual, because Silas had the hearing of a man who had spent 14 months alone in country where missing a sound could end you. But she was outside at the woodpile in the early afternoon when the wind shifted and brought it from below the distant sound of dogs at working a trail, 3 or 4 of them, by the voice moving with the purposeful coordination of animals that had been given a scent and confirmed it. She stood at the woodpile and listened for a full 10 seconds, placing the sound, calculating the distance and direction. Then she went inside. "Dogs on the south trail," she said, moving up. "Half-mile, maybe less." Silas was at the workbench. He went entirely still in the way she had seen him go, still before not frozen, but concentrated, every faculty engaged. How many? 3, possibly 4. He was already at the wall, lifting the rifle from its pegs. He checked the load with the rapid efficiency of someone for whom this was not a conscious action, but a trained reflex. Then he moved to the window and looked down the south approach where the trail emerged from the tree line into the open rock shelf below the cabin. "Pack the emergency bag," he said. "Everything we'd need for 3 days. Put it by the back wall." She was already moving. The emergency bag was a concept they had discussed in the first week, a contingency preparation she had raised and he had agreed to with a particular look that told her he had been thinking about it himself and had not yet found a way to raise it without implying a level of alarm he was not yet prepared to express. She had assembled the bag over 2 days, and it lived behind the sleeping room door, compact and accessible. She pulled it out and checked its contents against the inventory she held in her memory and added 3 things she had identified since the initial packing as gaps. Her hands were steady. She was aware of the steadiness as a deliberate achievement rather than a natural state. "Silas," she said, "I see them." She came to the window. Below the tree line, 4 figures had emerged onto the rock shelf, leading 2 dogs on long lines. The figures were moving with the directional certainty of men following a trail that had confirmed itself, not the tentative movement of travelers who were uncertain of their destination. They were dressed for serious cold, heavy coats and fur hats, and even from this distance she could see that at least 2 of them carried rifles on their backs and something shorter at their hips. The 4th figure was shorter than the others, dressed differently, moving with the particular slight hesitation of someone who was present not by professional necessity, but by some other motivation. "Do you recognize any of them?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with a quality in his voice she had not heard before, something controlled very carefully at the edges. "The man on the left, Garrett Walsh. He was Adelaide's father's man in Helena, head of their private security." A pause. "And the one behind him, the shorter one. That's Holt," he said, "Booth's man." The name landed in the room between them, and Cora absorbed its implications with the rapid precision that the situation required. Booth had known about Silas. She had fed him that information herself deliberately as misdirection and had miscalculated its trajectory. Booth had not been misdirected. Booth had been informed and had seen in that information not a distraction but a commercial opportunity, and had apparently conducted his own quiet investigation in the weeks since her departure, arriving at conclusions she had not anticipated because she had underestimated his specific variety of relentless self-interest. She had made an error. The error had 4 men and 2 dogs and was now 50 yards from their door. "I'm sorry," she said. It was the precise truth offered without elaboration. He looked at her briefly. "Don't be. You couldn't have predicted Holt." "I could have." "Then don't be sorry now. Be useful." He was right, and she knew it, and she set aside the weight of the error for later examination and put her attention on the immediate geometry of the problem. Walsh called up from the rock shelf. His voice carried clearly in the cold air a practiced projection, the voice of a man accustomed to delivering pronouncements. "Montgomery, we know you're up there. Come down and make this simple." Silas did not respond. He had moved from the window and was at the workbench gathering things she recognized as winter-specific equipment. The white canvas he used for snow cover on the eastern runs, the additional ammunition from the locked box at the back of the shelf. "What's your count?" she said. "Walsh and 3 hired men. Holt is not a fighter. He's a guide. He got them up the trail." He loaded the rifle with measured speed. "Walsh will have been in this kind of work before. The 3 with him are variable." "And the dogs. Tracking dogs, not attack dogs. They'll be tied off when the men get to work." From outside, Walsh again. "We have no grievance with the woman. Send her down, and we settle this between men." Cora looked at Silas. Something moved in his jaw. "He doesn't know you very well," Silas said. "No," she said. "He does not." She went to the back wall where she had stored behind the secondary woodpile inside the cabin the materials she had been preparing in the way that she prepared for most contingencies, quietly and without announcement, and over sufficient time that the preparation was complete before anyone thought to question it. 3 lengths of heavy chain with the large forged links used for securing the bear trap sets. The bear traps themselves, 4 of them, the heavy double-spring variety that Silas used for the largest game on the eastern run, and that she had been maintaining and testing for the past 2 weeks. He looked at the traps, then at her. "The approach from the north ridge," she said. "If Walsh sends men around to flank while he keeps us occupied at the front, they'll come through the north approach. It's the only covered route." "I know. The snow is deep enough up there to conceal a set trap to about 8 inches of surface." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the particular quality of attention he brought to things that surprised him. "You've been planning for this," he said. "I've been planning for the possibility of this," she said. "There's a difference." "Not much of one right now." From outside, a change. The dogs had been tied off. She could hear the shift in their sound, the frustrated complaint of animals restrained from a confirmed trail. Walsh was moving his men. "He's splitting them," Silas said from the window. 2 coming straight up, 2 going around." "North Ridge," she said. "North Ridge." She lifted 2 of the traps. They were heavy, the good ones always were, and she carried them the way she carried everything heavy from her center efficiently without the compensatory movement that announced effort. "Give me 12 minutes," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the full force of what was in his eyes, not the controlled assessment of a partner evaluating a tactical proposal, but something closer to what she had seen that evening, by the fire, raw and certain, and without the protective coating that people put over the things they could not afford to lose. 12 minutes, he said, "then I start." She went out the back. The north approach to the cabin was a narrow defile between 2 granite outcroppings that provided the only sheltered route to the rear of the structure, and she knew it the way she had come to know all the terrain within a half-mile of the cabin, which was well and specifically and in the dark if necessary. She moved through the back snow in the particular way Silas had shown her, for silent travel in deep powder weight distributed each step placed before being committed to the snowshoes she had put on at the back door, keeping her surface rather than plunging through. She could hear Walsh's voice still working from the front, a tactical distraction, the kind designed to keep attention fixed while the flanking move developed. She set the first trap at the entrance to the defile, where the granite narrowed to a single passage width beneath a light covering of disturbed snow that she smoothed with her gloved hand until it was indistinguishable from the surrounding surface. The second trap she placed 15 feet further in, at the point where the defile bent, and visibility was lowest. She was back at the cabin's rear door in 9 minutes. Oh, genius! She heard the first trap engage as she was pulling the door closed behind her. The sound carried cleanly in the cold air, a sharp mechanical report followed by a human sound that brought with it the particular quality of a situation that had just changed decisively. Silas's rifle spoke once from the front window. A pause. Then voices sharp and urgent, the reorganization of men who had expected a direct confrontation and encountered something more complicated. Walsh had not expected preparation. Men like Walsh, she had observed, tended to approach isolated targets with a confidence that was calibrated for the psychological effect on unprepared people, and they did not always adequately account for the possibility that the people they were approaching had been thinking about them specifically for an extended period. She took up her position at the side window with the heavy skinning knife in her right hand and the cleaver in her left, and watched the approach angle she had been assigned. Holt came around the south corner of the cabin alone. He had separated from the others, probably trying to find a route that avoided the front where Silas's rifle had established a clear field of control. He was moving with the ungainly speed of a frightened man rather than a tactical one, and he saw her in the window. At the same moment she saw him. And his face did exactly what Harlan Booth's face would have done in that moment, which was collapse into the specific expression of a man who has just understood that the arithmetic of the situation has been running against him for considerably longer than he realized. She was outside before he completed the thought behind that expression. He was not a large man, and he was not a brave one, and he had been Booth's errand runner and ledger keeper, and occasional enforcer of small pressures against people who had no recourse, and he had apparently added mountain guide to those qualifications when the money was sufficient. He swung the pistol he was carrying with the imprecision of someone who had not done this often enough to do it smoothly, and she was already inside the arc of his arm, using her weight and her forward momentum in the way that a person her size, who had spent a lifetime moving through a world that underestimated her, understood intuitively, which was not as a disadvantage, but as a force available for deployment. The pistol went into the snow. He went into the cabin wall. The cleaver's flat side, not the blade, connected with the side of his head with exactly the force she intended, and not a fraction more, and Holt sat down in the snow against the cabin wall, with his eyes not entirely focused, and remained there. She retrieved the pistol and went back inside. From the front, the situation had developed. Walsh had pulled back to the tree line with the one man he had remaining on the north approach. The other one detained at the defile and was now conducting a different calculation. She could hear it in the change of his voice, no longer the declarative pronouncement of a man arriving with predetermined authority, but the clipped functional speech of someone reassessing under adverse conditions. Silas's rifle cracked once more from the window. She heard Walsh curse a short, hard sound. Montgomery. Walsh's voice had changed further. The practiced authority was eroding at its edges, revealing something more functional beneath. This doesn't have to go further. Stand down, and we discuss terms. Silas looked at her from the window. She crossed the room and stood beside him, looking down at the tree vine where Walsh and his remaining man were positioned behind the large boulder that marked the trail's upper junction. He has one man left, Silas said quietly. The one from the defile is down. The other two are covering Walsh. That's a reduced position. He won't know the second trap deployed, she said. He'll think he still has two flanking. Silas's jaw set in the way it set when something was being decided. Walsh, he called out. His voice carried without effort, the voice of a man who had spent years calling across distances that made indoor speech seem like a courtesy. You came up here with a story that was built by people who bought the outcome they needed. I know what happened at the Channing mines. I have the assay records, the originals. A silence from the tree line. This was not a bluff. He had told her about the documents on the 8th night in the cabin, when the conversation had gone to the place where the most important things live, quietly and without preamble. He had the original assay reports from the Channing secondary mines copied before his exile by a clerk who owed him a debt of a different kind, stored in an oilskin packet that currently lived in the bottom of the pelt cache under the floorboards. He had been waiting for a moment when they had sufficient weight. "The records go to the territorial prosecutor in the spring," Silas continued. "Whether I am alive or not. I arranged for that before I came to the mountain. You can report to the Channings that killing me solves nothing. The documents travel independently." Another silence longer. Walsh spoke, but not to Silas. The voice was lower now, directed at the man beside him in the tree line. She could not make out the words, but she understood the function of them. A man revising his calculation. A hired professional determining at what point the terms of the original contract had been rendered inadequate by the conditions of the actual situation. The conditions included 2 disabled men, one sitting against the cabin wall in the snow, and a woman with a cleaver and a confiscated pistol, and the absolute quality of someone who had not come this far to have the conclusion rewritten by people who thought their money made the arithmetic simple. Holt's voice came from outside, slightly muffled, still sitting where she had left him. "Walsh, I want to go home." She almost said something to that. She did not. Walsh emerged from behind the boulder. He was carrying his rifle at the low position that meant something, not the raised threat position and not the slung carrying position, the middle option that a professional uses when he is willing to discuss a transition. He walked to the open ground below the cabin and stood in the snow with his face tipped up toward the window. "The documents," he said, "are already arranged," Silas said, "as I told you. And if I walk my men off this mountain, then you have fulfilled your professional obligation to report that the situation was more complicated than anticipated, and the Channings will need to find a different solution, which is not my problem and not yours." Walsh stood in the snow for a moment. He was a man in his 50s, Cora could see now, with the particular weathering of a man who had spent his life in this specific kind of work. And there was something in his face, not conscience exactly, but the fatigue of a man who has been doing the Channings' arithmetic for a very long time, and has just received, from an unexpected direction, a reasonable exit. "The woman stays out of any report," Walsh said. "The woman," Silas said with a very specific flatness, "is a free citizen who entered into a legal business partnership and is not party to any proceeding you might file." Walsh looked at the window for another moment. Then he turned and went back to the tree line and began the business of retrieving his men and his dogs and directing the entire enterprise back down the south trail toward the valley below. Silas watched until the last figure disappeared into the trees. Then he lowered the rifle and stood at the window with his forearms on the sill, and his head bent briefly, a single moment of something private that she did not interrupt. She went outside and checked Holt, who was conscious and cold and comprehensively unhappy. She handed him his coat, which had been knocked from his shoulders in the earlier exchange, and told him clearly and without emphasis that the trail down was the same trail he had come up, and that the temperature would drop significantly after dark. Holt looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man trying to locate the appropriate response to a situation his prior experience had not prepared him for. "Booth's going to want to know," he said, not a threat, almost a question. "Tell Booth," she said, "that the account is settled." She went back inside. Silas was at the hearth feeding the fire, back up from the coals that had dropped during the hours of attention directed elsewhere. She set the cleaver on the table and the pistol beside it and pulled off the outer coat and hung it by the door. The cabin was warm. It smelled of pine smoke and the venison she had left on the back of the stove at low heat before going out, and the particular smell of 2 people who had been sharing a small space through a mountain winter, which was not romantic but was entirely real. She sat down in her chair. After a moment he crossed the room and stood behind her chair and put his hands on her shoulders, not with any urgency, simply placing them there. And she felt the weight of those hands large and certain and familiar now, and she put one of her own hands over one of his. Outside, the wind moved through the iron pine peaks with the same ancient indifference it had brought to every human event that had ever occurred in their shadow, neither approving nor disapproving, simply continuous. The fire worked in the hearth, the venison simmered, and the night came down over the mountain slowly and completely, the way winter nights come in high country, with the absolute commitment of something that has nowhere else to be. She slept without interruption for the first time in weeks. She did not realize this until she woke in the gray early light and lay still for a moment, taking inventory of the ceiling beams above her, the fire reduced to deep orange coals in the hearth, the particular quality of silence that meant the wind had dropped overnight and the mountain was holding its breath. In that way it held its breath between storms. She had slept without the secondary awareness, the part of her that had been running like a lamp on low through every night since Copperhead Gulch, monitoring for sounds that did not belong, for the creak of a door or the particular weight of a boot on the stairs that meant Booth, or one of his men, was moving through the building with some errand that had her name on it. That lamp had gone out somewhere in the night. She lay still and noticed its absence, the way you notice the end of a sound you had stopped consciously hearing long ago by the quality of the silence it leaves. Silas was already up. She could hear him at the exterior, the rhythmic sound of the axe on the woodpile, a sound she had come to know the way she knew the sound of the fire and the wind, part of the cabin's breathing. She rose and built the fire up from the coals and set the coffee water on, and stood at the window while it heated, looking out at the high country in its winter stillness. The snow from the previous days had settled and crusted, and the morning light came off it at a low angle that turned the entire rock shelf and the meadow below into something that looked constructed rather than natural, every surface precise and reflective, the shadows blue and sharp. Below the shelf where Walsh and his men had stood the afternoon before, there was nothing but the clean record of the snowpack already beginning to fill with new powder, the traces that booted feet had made. The mountain had already begun its forgetting. She thought about what Silas had said to Walsh, the documents, the oilskin packet at the bottom of the pelt cache. She had not asked him about it directly in the weeks since he had first mentioned it, respecting the boundary of the thing, the way she respected the general territory of his prior life, taking what he offered and not pressing for the rest. But the documents had come out into the open now, and their existence had changed the geometry of the situation in ways that she was still mapping. He came in with the wood and stacked it by the hearth and looked at her at the window. "Coffee's almost ready," she said. He poured 2 cups and brought them to the table and sat, and she came and sat across from him, and they drank for a moment in the morning quiet. "Walsh won't come back," she said. It was not a question. "Walsh is a professional. He'll report that the contract terms have become untenable. The Channings will weigh the cost of a second attempt against the risk of the documents reaching Helena, and they'll find a different problem to occupy themselves with." He held the cup in both hands. "They're not stupid people. They're simply accustomed to buying the outcome they want, and I've made this particular outcome too expensive. And the prosecutor. The arrangement is real. I made it before I came to the mountain through a lawyer in Billings who owes me nothing and therefore has no reason to interfere with it. In the spring the packet goes. Whatever happens after that is the law's business, not mine." She looked at him across the table, at the man who had arrived at her back door as a problem and had turned out to be something more complicated and more permanent than any problem she had previously encountered. "You've been planning this for 14 months, she said. "I've been surviving for 14 months, he said. "There's a difference." The corner of his mouth moved. "You said that to me once. I borrowed it." She looked at her coffee cup. "What happens in the spring?" she said. She meant it as the practical question. It appeared to be the logistics of the pelt harvest, the trader in Millhaven, the 50-50 split they had agreed on in the root cellar of the Silver Spur Saloon in what felt now like a different lifetime. But she was aware, saying it, of the question underneath that question, the one that had been living in the cabin alongside them for weeks with the same patient silence as the cold. He set his cup down. "I'd like you to stay," he said. The words arrived simply without decoration in the same register he used for everything that mattered, which was the flat, honest register of a man who had decided that accuracy was more important than impression. She did not respond immediately. He did not press her. This was the quality she had come to trust most completely. In him, the understanding that a silence was not an absence, but a place where something real was being considered, and that it deserved to be waited out rather than filled. As a partner, she said. He looked at her directly. As whatever you decide. I won't put a name on it that you haven't chosen. She thought about spring. The spring she had been orienting herself toward for 20 months. The theoretical spring that had always been exactly one season away and had receded before her at the same pace she walked toward it. She thought about what spring actually looked like from this elevation, from what he had described in the evenings. The wild flowers above the tree line, and the light through the granite peaks, and the meadow below the cabin running with snowmelt and new grass. She thought about Cincinnati, about the locked room inside her that Edmund Price had entered and emptied. She had spent 20 months patching that room back together from the inside, working in the dark with whatever materials were available, and the result was not the original room. It was something sturdier and less trusting and more deliberately constructed, and she had believed for most of those 20 months that this was simply what remained, the fortified version, functional and sufficient. She had not anticipated the possibility of a door. All right, she said. He nodded once the way he received most things of importance, without theater. All right, he said. They finished the coffee. January passed, and then February each week, distinguishable from the last primarily by the subtle shifts in the light as the season began its long, reluctant turn toward spring. The trap line continued to produce. She had learned the full 30 miles of it by now, every station and its particular character, the places where the terrain favored certain animals and the places where the snowpack made setting difficult, and the one section along the western run where a family of foxes had established a territory so thoroughly that she had taken without discussion to bypassing those particular sets. He had noticed. He had not said anything for 2 weeks, and then had said one evening, "The western sets are producing low." "I've been running them wide," she said. A pause. "The kits," he said. "There are 4 of them," she said, "born late." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said, which was, she had come to understand, his equivalent of a considerable number of words. The wound had healed entirely by the end of January, the last of the deep tissue tightness releasing in a cold snap that he had worked through anyway, and what remained was a scar that she had seen only once the evening she had checked the final state of the healing and declared the treatment concluded. It was a significant scar. It would always be significant. It sat on his left side below the lowest rib, with the specific authority of something that had very nearly been the end of everything and had decided, through some combination of biology and assistance and sheer constitutional refusal, to become instead just another mark on a body that had been accumulating them for 40 years. She had pressed her palm flat against it for a moment before rebandaging, not with clinical intention, but with something she did not name, and he had been entirely still under her hand, and neither of them had spoken, and she had rebandaged, and he had pulled his shirt down, and they had gone to dinner. By March the light was coming in at a different angle through the cabin window, and lasting longer in the evening, and she had begun to notice the changes in the snow, the way it softened at midday now before recrusting at night, the way the shadows retreated slightly each morning from where they had been the morning before. It was in March that she found the papers. She had not been looking for them. She was reorganizing the pelt cache, rotating the oldest cured bundles to the top in preparation for the spring sale, when her hand found the oilskin packet beneath the deepest layer of pelts. She set it on the floor beside the open cache door and looked at it for a moment. She did not open it. It was not hers to open, but she left it on the table where he would see it when he came in from the evening exterior check, because she had been thinking about the spring trip to Millhaven, which would be their first significant contact with the valley since December, and she had been thinking about the lawyer in Billings, and she had a thought that she wanted to put to him. He came in and saw the packet and stood still for a moment. "I found it when I was rotating the pelts," she said. "I didn't open it." He sat at the table and looked at the oilskin. "I've been thinking about the spring trip," she said. She sat across from him. "Millhaven is 3 days. Billings is 10. If the pelts go through your trader in Millhaven as planned, and if I take the Millhaven to Billings stage while you make the return trip here, I can deliver the packet to your lawyer directly." He looked at her. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "You're thinking it's a risk to separate, but it's a greater risk to have both of us in Billings when the documents go. If the Channings have anyone watching for your name on a stage manifest, you shouldn't be on it. And your name means nothing to the Channings. I'm a woman who worked a kitchen in a mining town saloon. No one in Helena has any reason to be watching for me." He sat with this. She watched him working through it, following the same logical sequence she had followed over the past weeks, arriving at the same conclusion she had arrived at, which was that the proposal was tactically sound and that his objection to it, if he had one, was not tactical. 10 days, he said. "I've been on my own longer than 10 days, she said. "I know you have." He looked at the oilskin packet. "So have I. That is not my concern." She looked at him, at the man who had learned over 4 months of shared winter to put language to things that did not come easily to him, in language who had been practicing this honesty the way she had been practicing the trap line, with patience and repetition and the willingness to acknowledge when it was not going well. "I'll be back in 12, she said. "Give me the 2 extra days as margin." He looked up from the packet. "If you're not back in 12, he said, "I come after you." "I know," she said. "That's why 12 is enough." The plan was made. She spent the following days preparing for the trip with the same methodical attention she brought to all preparations, packing for the terrain and the weather and the specific requirements of traveling as a woman alone into a territorial capital on a mission of legal consequence. She was not, she had decided, going to be nervous about this. She was going to be competent, which was the same thing she had always been, and it had always been sufficient. It was the night before their departure to Millhaven, sitting by the fire in the final evening of the winter that had made them, that he reached into his coat and set something on the table between them. She looked at it. A small object carved from what appeared to be a piece of the granite shelf outside the cabin, rough-worked into a shape that was not immediately identifiable, and then was a mountain peak. 2 of them side by side, the particular double summit of the Iron Pine Range, as it appeared from the meadow below. The carving was not refined. It was not the work of an artist. It was the work of a man who had something specific to say, and no other available language for it. She picked it up. It fit in her palm with the comfortable weight of something that belonged there. "The winter before I came to the mountain," he said, "I stopped believing that any place would feel like mine, that anything would." He was looking at the fire. "I was wrong about that." She held the carved stone and looked at the fire beside him. "I was wrong about some things too," she said. He turned and looked at her, and she looked back, and the fire moved between them, and the mountain held its enormous patient darkness around the small lit room, and everything that needed to be said had either been said or would wait for the saying, because they had time. Now they had made themselves time, and it stretched ahead of them with the particular quality of a thing that has been chosen rather than inherited. She put the carved stone in her coat pocket. The trip to Millhaven took 2.5 days in the improving March conditions. They delivered the pelts to the trader, whose name was Aldous Crane, a small, meticulous man who examined the bundles with the reverence of someone handling significant currency, which they were. The accounting took most of an afternoon, and when it was complete, the numbers on the paper in front of them represented more actual money than Cora Vance had ever seen assigned to her name in a single document. Half of it was assigned to her name. She had made sure of that before they sat down. Crane looked at the split and at her, and then at Silas with the specific expression of a man recalibrating a situation. "Miss Vance is my partner," Silas said. "The arrangement is equal." Crane returned to the paperwork without further expression. She took the billing stage the following morning. Silas stood at the stage depot in Millhaven, and she climbed up and settled her bag and looked down at him from the window. He stood in the early light with his hands in his coat pockets and his shoulders against the wind, and looked back at her with the look that she now knew well enough to read without the language it was replacing. 12 days, she said. 11, he said. She almost smiled. She turned to face the road ahead as the stage pulled out. Billings was 3 days of hard road, and then a city of sufficient size to remind her that the world beyond the Iron Pine Peaks had continued its operations through the winter without any particular concern for what was happening on the mountain. She found the lawyer, a man named Everett Kane, in an office above a hardware merchant on Montana Avenue, and she sat across from his desk in the good coat she had packed specifically for this purpose and explained the situation with the clarity and precision of someone who had been rehearsing the salient points for 10 days on a trapline at elevation. Kane listened without interrupting, which she took as a professional courtesy and also as evidence that he was actually listening rather than simply waiting for her to finish. She placed the oilskin packet on his desk. He opened it and examined the documents. His expression changed in the specific way that an attorney's expression changes when he is looking at something that is both exactly what was promised and more significant than he had entirely anticipated. "These are originals," he said. "Yes." "The signatures are Channing's." The handwriting was confirmed by a second party before the copies were made. Kane looked at her across the desk with a recalibrated attention. "You are Mr. Montgomery's representative," he said. "I am his partner," she said. "The distinction matters." He sat with the documents for a long moment. Then he told her what the documents represented in specific legal terms, which she already knew in general terms, and what the likely trajectory of their submission to the territorial prosecutor would be, which she had estimated correctly in most particulars, and what the risk was to Silas specifically once the submission was made, which was the part she had come to verify. If the documents go in as arranged, Kane said, Montgomery is effectively transformed from a fugitive to a witness. The fraud charges against him become indefensible in the light of what he documented. The Channing's legal exposure is substantial enough that pursuing him becomes a liability rather than an asset. In plain terms, they'll be too busy protecting themselves to spend money hunting him. She stood and extended her hand. He shook it with the slight adjustment of a man who had expected something and received something more. She was back in Millhaven on the 10th day, which was a full day ahead of the margin she had given herself because she had not been cautious in Billings. She had been efficient, and efficiency was simply what she was. Silas was at the depot when the stage came in. He had not waited until the 11th day. He was there on the 10th, which told her everything about the 11 days on the mountain without her, and she did not make an issue of it. She climbed down with her bag and stood in front of him and said, "It's done." He looked at her for a moment with the full force of what those 3 words represented, everything that had been set in motion in a root cellar 14 months ago, and in a mountain cabin 4 months ago, and in a law office in Billings 3 days ago, the long, complicated machinery of a life reassembling itself into something that was finally pointed in the right direction. He put his arms around her, not with urgency, not with the desperation of relief, but with the deliberate, encompassing certainty of a man who has made a decision and is expressing it physically. She put her face against his coat and felt the mountain on him, the cold and the pine, and the particular solidity of a person who is exactly where they are and nowhere else. They did not go back to Copperhead Gulch. There was no reason to go back to Copperhead Gulch. They went back up the mountain. Spring came to the Iron Pine Peaks in the way that spring comes to high country, not gently and not all at once, but in contested advances, a warm day followed by 3 cold ones, the snowpack retreating by degrees from the south-facing slopes, while the north faces held their winter for another month. The meadow below the cabin ran with snowmelt in rivulets that carved new channels through the old grass, and encouraged by early May, the first green of the new season, pushing up through the gray of what the winter had flattened. She stood on the porch in the May morning with her coffee and watched it. The wildflowers he had described in the evenings by the fire were not yet visible at this elevation. They would come later in June when the snowpack above the meadow released its water into the soil and the short mountain summer began its concentrated, brilliant run. But she could see the ground was ready. She could see in the color of the new grass and the particular quality of the morning light warmer now and coming from a higher angle that the mountain was making its preparations. She heard him at the door behind her, and then he was beside her on the porch with his own cup, looking out at the meadow in the same direction. She thought about the woman who had stood in a root cellar and stirred elk stew at 20 minutes past 4 in the morning and held herself together by the specific architecture of endurance by the promise of a spring that was always one season away. She thought about that woman with the particular mixture of recognition and distance that you feel toward a self you have genuinely left behind, not abandoned, because nothing that keeps a person alive deserves abandonment, but surpassed, grown through, like a coat that did not fit anymore, because the body inside it had changed into something that required more room. She had more room now. She had chosen it and defended it and built it with her own hands. The mountain was enormous above them, and the meadow ran with snowmelt below, and the smoke from the hearth inside the cabin rose straight up in the still morning air, pale against the enormous blue of the sky visible for miles in every direction. Evidence of a fire that was burning, a fire that was tended, a fire that had no intention of going out. She put her hand around his on the porch railing. He covered it with his the way he covered things he was keeping. Below them, the Iron Pine Meadow was turning green. Above them, the peaks held their altitude cold and clean and permanent, and the sky above those peaks was the specific blue of a Montana spring morning, a blue so uncompromised and complete that it looked less like weather and more like a decision. Cora Vance looked at it without flinching. She had outlasted. She had chosen. She had fought for the life she was now living with the same hands that had stirred the stew and set the traps and carried the wounded man off the frozen ground, and those hands were scarred and strong and covered in the particular lanolin softness of a woman who had learned against considerable evidence to take care of herself. The smoke rose from the chimney into the blue sky. It rose a long time.